Okay, so it's 10:45 in the morning on Wednesday. We're in the Chambach House. This is David Nickles. He is a moderator for the DMT Nexus and a very interesting man who I've gotten to meet in person for the first time here at this festival. And his presentation, Traversing the Psychedelic Chasm, is definitely probably going to break some bubbles and open some whole new beautiful insight. So everybody, let's give a warm welcome to Dave Nickles.
Thank you. Thanks for all coming out. I know it's kind of early in the morning. I hope you all had fun last night. But yeah, let's just get to it. So about 3 months ago, I got a call from a friend who's been involved in psychedelic harm reduction and the broader psychedelic culture, capital P, capital C, for a really long time. And, I picked up the phone, and the first things I hear, it's all bullshit. Everybody that's involved in this psychedelic culture or harm reduction scene or whatever you want to call it, it's all bullshit, we've all been hoodwinked. And as I listened to him go on about the lip service that gets paid to all of these different ideas within these subcultures, I found myself, really amused and also agreeing with him. And you might ask why the amusement? Well, to sort of paraphrase an old saying, we're the ones who've been hoodwinking ourselves. And so, for over half a century, psychedelics have been at the center of counterculture narratives about weirdness, resistance, consciousness. And these narratives often contain the notion that psychedelics will herald a new age of prosperity and justice and peace. But as we hear these claims and with the great frequency with which they're mentioned, we find ourselves in a rather bleak moment in history. Ecological destruction is at a fever pitch. Economic architects attempt to cram austerity measures down our throat. Xenophobic and nationalistic sentiments are rising around the world, embodied in numerous political parties. And so even as these destructive and domineering forces seem to sort of ripple throughout the world, there's no shortage of first-time ayahuasca initiates that seem very eager to tell you about how Madre Ayahuasca is escaping the jungle and is here to bring a planetary revolution for all of us. And the thing that gets me about this is that I don't really know what it means. What would it look like to see a revolution on a truly planetary scale? I can't even imagine things on a national scale, given how complex all of the interrelationships are between different groups of people with their own needs, wants, and desires. So I don't really understand how it is that so many people feel so comfortable making assertions on such a grand scale. And one of my sort of joking hypotheses about this is that, feeling a rush of dopamine and serotonin and all of these other neurochemicals that tend to accompany a positive ayahuasca experience sort of makes people comfortable with throwing these ideas out there. Or, maybe it's just that they get a sense of what's possible for them and they see the potential to improve various things in their life. And so they extrapolate that to a planetary scale because it seems so straightforward. Or maybe it's neither of those things, or both of those things, or a million other things. And honestly, if we had a discussion on this, we could probably go at it for hours and not really get anywhere, especially if we took a look at the broader historical context. So, for example, consider the rush to Huautla de Jimenez following the publication of R. Gordon Wasson's article in 1957 in Time magazine entitled Seeking the Magic Mushroom. Now, this article led to numerous people trekking to Huautla de Jimenez in hopes of experiencing the sacred ritual that Wasson described in his writing. And just as wide-eyed and eager as today's would-be ayahuasqueros, this initial wave of industrial drug tourists had a really profound and eager quest to, obtain access to this ritual and to experience precisely what Wasson described. Yet the Mazatec people had guarded this ritual from public knowledge or global trade for generations. And once the genie was brought out of the bottle, it wasn't really possible to put it back, not that anyone appears to have been trying. The devastation was so bad that in 1970, Wasson himself lamented the impact of this publicity on the Mazatec people and their mushroom ritual. So this tale, for people who are very eager to sort of espouse the supposed benefits of shamanic or drug tourism, this tale should serve as a cautionary warning about the sort of dynamics that have taken place when people from industrial countries, generally the global north, go in search of these indigenous rituals. So then perhaps, at least for the moment, we can forget questions of planetary revolution and the transcendence of our collective consciousness into some blissful psychedelic state. Instead, let's take a moment and consider the reality, or at least some of the realities that we appear to face. You know, as I mentioned earlier, we're at a point in history where economic crisis is truly, coming to a head. We find ourselves locked into austerity measures that we have no control over. We find ourselves at the subjugation of countless surveillance states. We don't have the option to drop out, to unplug, or to disconnect from the maelstrom that we face in our lives on a daily basis. So then, by what magic could psychedelics save us from this situation? Now, before I start to sound too much like a jaded cynic, I'd like to rewind for a moment and go back to my first true psychedelic experience, which involved taking 3.5 grams of psilocybe cubensis mushrooms my first year at university. And I was out in the woods in this small university town, and as the trip started to peak, I came across this fallen tree where the root mass extended onto the path that I was on. And as I approached the roots, I saw that it was teeming with ants and beetles, fungus was growing, moss was growing, and all of a sudden I found myself as though I were within a nature documentary. This strangely familiar but clearly other consciousness entered and began to steer my awareness. And all of a sudden, I sort of had this realization that cycles of life and death don't start or stop in any concretely defined place. Here I was seeing life springing from death, springing from life, and there I was just in the midst of it. And so, as I had this realization, all of a sudden, everything sort of zoomed out, and my consciousness felt like it was overridden again, as I realized that even as I was standing in this little tiny patch of forest in a completely domesticated college town, I was seeing all of these incredible interconnections and these ecosystems at play. And I had a flash of realizing that if I'm seeing this on such a tiny scale, imagine what's existing, what's going on in the most biodiverse regions of this planet. And all of a sudden there was this tremendous pang of sorrow as I realized here we are as humans, engaged in destroying these ecological connections. And in the wake of that realization, it hit me. That it's not that human beings are destroying these ecological systems, but it's human beings organized into corporate hierarchies. These tyrannical structures are literally engaged in acts of for-profit insanity, poisoning the air we breathe, the water we drink, the ground we derive sustenance from. We as human beings have always created a certain level of ecological destruction. It goes with existing, and pretty much all animals do it. We need food, clothes, and shelter in order to survive. But in our extreme model of consumer capitalism perpetuated by market-driven consumption, we find ourselves racing to the most extreme ends of consumption of technological trinkets. To borrow from Fight Club, many of us find ourselves working jobs we hate so we can buy shit we don't need. So as I'm standing in the woods, literally mind blown at the things I'm seeing and feeling, not understanding how it's possible, all of a sudden this interplay between ecological integrity and capitalism, industrial capitalism, starts really dominating the experience. And as I watch these hallucinated vines drop from the trees all around me, I realize that in the society in which I live, food, clothes, and shelter are locked into this industrial paradigm. And that, I don't have the ability to remove myself from this. Vagrancy and homelessness are criminalized acts, and land, which at one point had been the global commons, has been roped off by people with greater resources and declared off limits to everyone else. So it's at this moment that my mourning for the ecological integrity of these systems sort of turned inwardly, and I realized that here I was at school, a part of this system, in order to secure papers that would ensure my survival, hopefully, within this system, and that survival came with its own cost, that it exacted its own ecological destruction as being part of that system. Economies as they're currently conceived are inherently destructive and exploitative, relying on extractive processes to essentially generate wealth for an incredibly tiny minority. Participating in these economies is both destructive and coerced. I can't opt out, and even if I did, it would have minimal effect as my minuscule purchasing power is irrelevant. People who talk about voting with their dollars forget that this is for people who have dollars in the first place. And then, of course, there's the completely lopsided global distribution of dollars, a living legacy of capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism, and the fact that militaries and corporations are the largest consumer entities on the planet and therefore have the most weight within that arena. So as my head is really swimming with all of these tryptamine-facilitated visions and my heart is just surging with these emotions, I realize that the only option I have is to resist. The logic of capitalism is a race to the bottom that seeks to incorporate and commodify the entirety of existence and bring it all into capitalist enterprise. Attached to these systems are the machinery of industrial civilization, which is destroying global ecosystems at truly alarming rates. Again, I can't opt out, and even if I did, opting out wouldn't do anything to protect me or other life on this planet in the event that these processes destroy the life support systems on spaceship Earth. Capitalism and the logic therein dictates that these processes won't stop on their own, as stopping isn't profitable. Thus, my conclusion in that moment was resistance is necessary. And so as I came down, I reflected on all of these realizations and interrelationships. The death of planetary ecosystems was presented to me by the mushrooms, or the combination of my own neurochemistry and the mushrooms. And the logic of capitalism indicated to me that this death would not stop unless forcibly forestalled. So for me, the conclusion was resistance, which was made that much more profound because I could feel the interconnection of myself and the other life in the forest. I could see the flowers breathing. I could see all of the tiny interconnections. I could feel how I was a part of that. And for me, that was something that I came to label as experiential knowledge. And the beauty of experiential knowledge and its danger to entrenched systems of power is that it can't be taken from you. Whether it's the felt realization that all ecosystems and life on this planet are interconnected, or the sense of accomplishment that comes with mastering a particular skill, or the cascading possibilities that can come from liberating an abandoned piece of property, these are experiences that are encountered and processed in the present. They're subjectively experienced. They carry a weight that's undeniable and inalienable precisely because you, as the experience, have a direct connection with what has taken place. They can only be invalidated in the minds of those who haven't experienced them, those who have not participated in them, those whose opinions about these experiences are ultimately irrelevant to the experiencer. So the point behind recounting this story is to highlight that, even as this mushroom trip presented me with the beauty of ecological integrity and made me feel more comfortable with my own mortality and cycles of death and life, at the same time, that beauty for me was indivisible from the horrors threatening its very existence. And even as this experience left me with all of this comfort and peace and clarity for perhaps the first time in my life, something cried out that this ongoing devastation extends beyond this natural relationship between living and dying. And perhaps most importantly for me, it highlighted that there are concrete reasons why we're in the situation that we're in. To quote Utah Phillips, "The earth is not dying, it's being killed. And the people who are killing it have names and addresses." As far as I can tell, there isn't some magic mushroom goddess that's going to clean up the rivers and the oceans. There isn't an ayahuasca spirit that's going to rebuild the mountains and restore the forests. There isn't a DMT entity that's going to clear up the smog. These ecological conditions exist. They haven't appeared out of the blue. They're the results of the structural mechanisms and components that are required to sustain global industrial capitalism. Directly experiencing the beauty of planetary interconnection simultaneously with the despair of realizing the destruction and devastation that's underway in this global ecocide is rather unsettling, to say the least. So, what then does it mean to integrate these experiences into our daily lives? Based on conversations I've had with numerous people over the past decade, the themes of ecological integrity, feeling at peace with death and dying, feeling that love is a universal and that it needs to be propagated, and this respect for life all seem to be very common experiences within the realm of psychedelics. However, when we come down and return to our daily lives from these experiences, many of us find ourselves living in situations that are drastically at odds with the lessons that we get from these experiences that we may cherish the most. In many ways, the structures and institutions that we return to trap us into behaviors and systems that we know to be destructive. And if we can't escape from living systems and environments that we recognize are predicated on destruction, how do we turn psychedelic lessons about life and the environment into meaningful practice? The common answer that I seem to get tends to be along the lines of, we take whatever little steps we can to show each other love, or to plant seeds and gardens wherever possible, to find the others who've had these experiences and talk about their implications, or to engage in a plethora of other small acts that we can carve out in our day-to-day lives. But how many of these small behaviors actually come to meaningful change? How many of these acts do more than make us just feel good about ourselves and feel like we're putting some of that into practice? I think that the importance of integration extends beyond our personal lives and daily habits. Yes, I mean, by all means, if you feel that all there is love and that propagating that love is of the utmost importance, by all means, propagate that love. But I think it's important to not lose sight of the broader geopolitical contexts in which we live. I don't think we can love away systemic problems like extractive industry and the ecological destruction that accompanies it. Nor do I think systemic problems like international conflicts and economic hierarchies that are perpetuated by various states will be loved away by our intentions, no matter how hard we put them out there. There are really existing material and social circumstances that contribute and dictate to these structures. Without working to build systemic understandings and critiques of these structures through which to apply our psychedelic insights, we lose much of the potential for change that these substances seem to offer to us. Consider policing in the United States, where there's a long history of white supremacy and where police murders of people of color have long been non-prosecuted, overlooked, intentionally covered up, and otherwise excused. In response to the ongoing murders of black people at the hands of police, many people in the United States are quick to say, oh no, it's just a few bad cops, or, these are good people just trying to do their jobs. There's a few bad apples, and once we can get accountability for them and get them out, then everything will be great. But the problem is that these types of statements miss the actual history and purpose of policing in the United States. The modern American police force actually stems from northern city watches and southern slave-catching patrols whose stated purpose and intention was to exert control over what were called dangerous classes. And precisely which populations were considered to be dangerous really varied according to whim, but generally they've included the urban poor, slaves, immigrants, radicals, prostitutes, vagrants, and other social outsiders. These people were generally isolated and targeted based on claims about their deviant values or alien status, and the actual laws as to what was criminal, that is, what counted as crime, were often reverse engineered based on the actions of these groups. So the very laws that the police are tasked with upholding are often motivated by racist and classist agendas. The disproportionate murders, arrests, and sentencing of people of color and poor people bear out the cold statistical facts of this reality, while the ongoing video documentation of murders of black and brown people show this horrific system in action. So even though it might be possible to engage with individual cops as human beings, to show them love and care, doing so doesn't actually address the systemic nature of policing as a means for controlling social outsiders. So if you feel that it's important to treat cops with love and respect, again, by all means, please do so. But I would ask you to also imagine what it could look like to work towards building a world without police. As we see the legalization of drugs creeping over the horizon, alongside the rising xenophobia and the increase in for-profit prisons and incarceration of so-called illegal immigrants, I think it's important to remember that we as drug users have been criminalized throughout recent history. We have an affinity with these other criminal populations, even if you don't like to acknowledge you're a criminal. We have affinity with so-called illegal immigrants. Just because we may soon find that we are no longer incarcerated or criminalized as a result of the substances we choose to put into our bodies, that doesn't mean that these same systems that arbitrarily criminalized us have ceased to arbitrarily criminalize all of these other people. And so, in looking at that broader approach to integration, perhaps one vein of integration could be to work towards lovingly dismantling the institution of police. I think that the psychedelic resurgence of the past decade or two has seen widespread intellectual laziness and consumerist goals. Feel-good sound bites have been substituted for critical thinking. The commodification of ceremony appears in many cases to be more popular than creating personally meaningful rituals, and the marketing of psychedelics and the experiences they can facilitate stands in opposition to many of the commonly espoused values that you can encounter just walking around a festival like this. But a lack of structural analysis is really only one component of the problems with many of the ideas that seem to be increasingly popular within psychedelic circles. The following quotes are from one individual who, after having their first psychedelic experience, decided to open an online media outlet to spread the gospel. Now, I think that many of us can empathize and relate with this. I know after my first trips, I was certainly ready to talk to anyone I could about it. And, given that here we are having, this dialogue, clearly I still feel that way to some extent. So the problem with the quotes that are about to come up, it's not so much that desire to share, but but some of the more naive and ignorant themes that get propagated and the lack of systemic analysis of the problems that are being addressed. So this first quote: "We've been told psychedelics are drugs. A lot of these psychedelic drugs are medicines, and they've been used in natural cultures to purge traumas. A lot of these natural cultures don't know what anxiety and depression are. They don't have words for those in their culture because they've been working with these medicines for so long." Now, even if we ignore the problematic dichotomy between drug and medicine and dose and setting and all of that, this type of imagery of the noble savage, of the imagined remote tribesman, of a so-called natural culture who's unaffected by the ills of the modern world, is both racist and ignorant. Do psychedelics show remarkable potential as trauma therapies? Absolutely. But to take that and extrapolate some sort of imagined notion of anxiety-free cultures that don't have words for depression because they've been dosing for so long is incredibly problematic, especially if you consider the actual events taking place in the real locations where some of these imagined remote tribesmen could be projected to live. So now, consider the actual indigenous folks living in Ecuador's Yasuni Basin, which is one of the world's most biodiverse regions. Starting in 2013, the Ecuadorian government approved oil drilling in the Yasuni Basin, and actually this year they just drilled the first 200 wells near the uncontacted Tagari and Toromaneni peoples. Ecuador has been dealing with pollution from oil drilling since the 1970s, so to me it seems both illogical and offensive to claim that the indigenous folks living in such a situation are somehow free from anxiety, or that they may have access to compounds that will magically cure them from the ills that are taking place, as though somehow dosing psychedelics is an antidote or a fix for the actual physical despoilation of your living environment. But this is sort of only the first problem. I'm going to bring up a whole bunch of quotes and give you a moment to sort of read through some of them. I hope it's not too small. If so, just throw up a hand and we can read some. Okay. So, even if we ignore the kind of silliness of the assertion that self-healing or psychedelic healing trumps Western medicine, this series of quotes, to me, evidences some of the problems that accompany making claims about psychedelics without any sort of structural analysis. First, just because we do drugs doesn't necessarily mean we change anything. Drugs aren't inherently good or bad, they're inherently drugs. The Aztecs took mushrooms and engaged in ritual human sacrifice. Charles Manson and his cult took LSD and murdered people. Psychedelics are tools. This is precisely why integration and intention matter. But if we examine these quotes further and we look at what's actually being said, there's clear contradiction as well as additional questionable assertions. For example, being a productive citizen within consumer society means contributing to the very systems and structures that are responsible for the ecological destruction and social domination that leaves so many people feeling depressed and powerless. The notion that psychedelics will heal people and thereby make them good little producers and consumers is not only highly questionable, but also contradicts the following assertion that psychedelics are capable of making people do complete 180s. And speaking of 180s, there's not really any specifics given as to what is considered to be a responsible investment, so it's kind of hard to really dig into that quote. But that said, most capital investment serves the purpose of further perpetuating the horrors and abuses of capitalism. even when invested in so-called green or sustainable or responsible companies. Generally speaking, industrial production or consumption requires the destruction of the environment and isn't ecologically sustainable or beneficial. Can opening a responsible factory or creating a conscious consumer product that requires the extraction and refinement of raw materials really do a greater ecological good than if those things weren't created in the first place? Is it possible for them to exact less environmental toll than not engaging in those endeavors to begin with? And then there's the question of who benefits, even from supposedly clean technologies, especially those that have dirty origins. So it might be nice to have, what we tend to call clean energy from things like wind power, but then again, where do those rare earth metals come from? What does it look like on the ground in China, where they're extracting and mining and refining all of these compounds, where the water is undrinkable and the air is poisoned? How clean is clean, and for whom? And just as with sustainable industrial technology, the prospect of bankers and stockbrokers and other business people moving to foreign countries to open up retreat centers raises so many questions about power dynamics, cultural appropriation, and ecological integrity that painting it as a clear-cut good makes no sense. These are the absurd statements that stem from viewing psychedelics and their experiences in a vacuum, as inherently good, and divorced from the broader socio-political context in which they exist. So the point of this critique is to demonstrate that while psychedelic integration is generally discussed in the context of personal understandings and decisions in daily life, following psychedelic insight to their logical conclusion, or at least trying to expand the picture of those implications, should lead to solutions or ideas or the beginning of thoughts that end up as more than just trite cliches or platitudes or other nice or fanciful statements. Perhaps one of the most bizarre and troubling areas of commodification and appropriation is that of ritual and ceremony. I would contend that whether we're discussing psychedelics and their experiences in ceremonies or our daily routines, such as waking up in the morning and what we do to start a day, that ritual at its ideal should be personally meaningful. Whether we consider, the most mundane to the most spiritual practices, if somebody asks you why you do what you do, there should be some explanation that has a meaningful purpose for you. So in the case of religious ritual, I context to explain some of the ceremonial or ritual or object components that go in, but I think if you actually sat and thought about it, you would find that there is something there. So take, for example, the Jewish tradition of eating unleavened bread or matzah during Passover. This stems from a series of practices aimed at memorializing the Jews' enslavement in and exodus from Egypt, at least according to the biblical narrative. So, according to the story, when the Jews were finally able to leave Egypt, they did so in such a rush that the bread they were baking didn't have time to rise. As a result, they were left with a flat, crispy, wafer-like, and none too pleasant result. The practice of avoiding leavened goods lasts for the predetermined period of 7 days and accompanies a whole host of other rituals and ceremonies that, again, are oriented towards the memorialization of this exodus. So this ritual practice of cutting out leavened goods from your diet doesn't have an intrinsic value. It's not a dietary choice. Furthermore, it seems fairly difficult to argue that this particular practice has much cultural significance for non-Jews, especially when you consider that even the best tasting matzah often falls well short of the worst crackers you can find. So then, what does matzah have in common with ayahuasca? Ultimately nothing. Yet that difference is what's really interesting in exploring, because while we don't see Gentiles flocking to to find authentic Passover rituals and have unique or authentic seders and recreate all of these ceremonial components, we do see that very thing happening with ayahuasca and ayahuasca ceremonies. And, you know, many people claim that they're in search of the authentic ayahuasca experience as though that construct actually exists. And sure, maybe there would be people that are interested in the authentic Passover experience if matzah offered the same psychoactive effects as ayahuasca. But for the moment, let's stick to the ceremony and ritual and put the psychoactive effects to the side. Having met numerous people eager to participate in ayahuasca ceremonies, I always find it interesting how many of them claim to know what makes a ceremony authentic, or what makes a good shaman. You know, they tell you, he must have agua de Florida and mapacho. He must blow the mapacho on the crown of your head while singing Icaros perfectly calibrated to your unique situation. Does he utilize la flema? If so, oh, that's a benefit. And you better hope that he has that real potent ayahuasca, because it doesn't taste very good. And if you have to drink multiple times, you may not have a good experience. And so, and they go on and on with this list, and until you interrupt them, you know, it's like an unbroken stream of consciousness freight train just barreling down at you. And yet, if you interrupt them and you ask them about the wide variety of plants used across these cultures that have long, vibrant histories of ayahuasca use, many of them stare at you blankly. And some of them say, well, aren't there just two main plants used in ayahuasca? You know, I thought it was about the DMT and the beta-carbolines, and, you know, they don't even realize that, you know, going way back, ayahuasca referred to the Banisteriopsis caapi, to the vine, not to the DMT-containing admixture plants. You know, we've begun to focus on that flash because it's intriguing. And yet, their surprise quickly evaporates if you take a step back and they go right back into it and they start telling you about all of the other components that need to be checked off. You know, the shaman must abstain from salt and sex and alcohol and other drugs. He must only work with whole plant medicines so as not to disrespect the plant spirits. He must be free of the baser human behaviors. And they go on and on and on. And yet, even when I've shared stories with some of these people of experiences and encounters that evidence the great amount of cultural diversity that exists among these peoples, they seem to shake off the notion that complex cultural diversity might be a very real thing. And they immediately get back on track with trying to tell me about the authentic shamans and retreat centers that they plan on visiting and why it's going to be so life-changing for them. They seem to have little interest in the fact that these traditions vary significantly in groups with these long histories of ayahuasca use. And despite their lack of experience or knowledge, they seem unable to acknowledge the fact that making these statements about what is or is not proper or authentic is damn near impossible when talking in vague statements about abstract groups of people and general ayahuasca ceremonies. And as I've been thinking about this, you know, there are two main things that make these encounters so troubling to me. First is the fact that it seems that many of these people find it almost comforting to dehumanize the subjects of their interest. You know, they turn them into caricatures based on their perceptualizations of cultures that use ayahuasca, you know, and they appear to lack the understanding that these people are also human. And they also seem to lack any sort of desire for personal engagement or agency with their own experiences. You know, it's almost as if they believe that playing voyeur to another culture's practices and ceremonies, it's like they can just be along for the ride, even though it's their own neurochemistry and biology that these potions are interacting with. The dehumanization aspect present in these sorts of discussion actually reminds me of a parable that Geronimo Munoz shared in a talk back in 2011 entitled Ayahuasca and the Gringos. And the tale goes something like this. So imagine that there's an old-style cowboy who lives out in Texas. And, you know, he's got cattle and horses, and he has a bunch of children. And the kids know what their father does, but they also like pop culture and hip-hop. They've got internet and radio. And, they're not really particularly thrilled with their father's job. They get it, but they don't really like when he goes on and on about the cows and the horses. And, then one day this millionaire German shows up, and he's got tons of money and tons of time. No offense, by the way, no offense to anyone who's German. This is just the parable that was shared. So, he speaks English, but not very well. And he's totally fascinated with cowboys, wants to be a cowboy, wants to study cowboys. And when he sees the father, he's just like, wow, a real cowboy. And so, at some point, the father gets swept up in this whole thing, because here he has an audience who, unlike his kids, is actually really interested in what he does. And so, the German hangs around, and he's nice, and he's got plenty of money. But he's a bit different, he doesn't speak English, and he doesn't quite understand everything that gets said. He misses some words here and there. He's a little funny about his food, and sometimes he gives the cowboy this real disapproving look, like he doesn't like when he sees that the cowboy gets drunk, or maybe the cowboy comes home after a long day of work and gets into a fight with his family, and the German's just not, doesn't like it. So this relationship builds up over a few months, and the cowboy starts to get sick of the German, but then a couple more Germans appear, and then more and more. And since the old cowboy lifestyle is dying out, all of these Germans are running around, and they're having trouble finding a cowboy. So all of a sudden, one of them gets this idea, and he posts up a sign, "Cowboy School, German spoken, Euros accepted." And, he thinks to himself, I didn't like so much of these things that the old cowboy did. I'll play the role of the old cowboy, and I'll be exactly the type of cowboy that I wanted to see. And so when he starts doing that, all of these Germans who were there to see an authentic cowboy, they find him, and he's exactly what they want, and they go and they pay and they love it. And so you wind up with this bizarre dance of one culture sort of packaging and selling a caricature of another culture back to itself. And because that caricature meets the Germans' preconceived conceptualizations and notions of what it is to be a cowboy, the caricature becomes hailed as being more authentic than the actual cowboy culture that it's attempting to emulate. And so I know that the parable itself may seem kind of silly, but the reality is that this is taking place in the actual world of drug tourism. And these dynamics are by no means limited to the realms of psychedelics or shamanism. They're part and parcel of dominant culture. Exploitation, appropriation, commodification have always been part of that. But the interesting thing about this is that the psychedelic experience or experiences are uniquely situated in that they're direct experiences that are available to anyone who wants to experience them. You don't need someone else's ritual in order to find personally meaningful insight through psychedelics. You don't need someone else's cultural objects in order to experience the divine mystery. You just need a willingness to see what's behind the curtain. So it seems to me that we need to create new modes of engagement around these substances and experiences, rather than working to stitch them into dominant culture, where they can be recuperated by the machinery of industrial civilization or capitalism. I think that we need to make our own narratives and meaningful rituals for these experiences that, rather than attempting to extract them from cultures that have borne the brunt and struggled with the problems of colonialism and imperialism for hundreds of years, that we need to break free from that mold. That, I have real questions about what could it look like to actually engage in psychedelic mutual aid and to build something collaborative as us. I don't have answers to this question, largely because I think that the answers to what that looks like have to stem from the decisions that we make in our lives, where we live day to day, the people that we live with, the people that we interact, the various communities that we're a part of, both temporary and more permanent. And so, with that said, there are already projects and attitudes in play that I think point in some directions worth exploring. So in contrast to the commodification of psychedelic compounds and ceremonies, what would it be like to openly share these compounds and plants and the experiences they facilitate? Consider Share the Seeds. This is a website that's open to anyone who wants to join, that allows for people to trade seeds and ethnobotanicals all around the world, where you can literally go in with nothing and work to build your own entheogenic garden with plants from literally every continent. You know, I'm curious what it might look like to take that one step further and start bringing some of these to local festivals where we could trade with other people, or perhaps share them again with people who might not be aware that these are resources that exist, where people could then be encouraged to start their own gardens and to share that and to spread that, you know, and to take that, you know, sort of in a slightly different direction. How many of us are experienced tripping by ourselves, you know, free from retreat centers or tourist traps? How many of us have our own rituals and ceremonies that have personal meaning, that are truly significant, and that we've developed over years of practice? What could it look like to share those components and those little pieces of ritual and ceremony with each other? What would it be like to actually stitch together something collaborative from all of us? Is it really more authentic to travel halfway around the world to be a psychedelic voyeur than to anchor these experiences and ceremonies and rituals, again, in our daily lives, where we live, with the people that we share our space, our ideas, our love, our experiences of reality with? Personally, you know, the groups of people that I've had the beautiful experiences of getting to share those types of ceremonies have been truly eye-opening. And I think that it's not unusual that in any group of people, there's usually something that everyone can bring to the table. Some of my most meaningful experiences have come from precisely these types of ceremonies. And not only has it made for great ceremonies and experiences, but it's really enriched the relationships that I've had with these people. Rather than returning home from a retreat center with faint memories of fellow participants and other customers, I get this chance for opportunities to enrich these experiences, to come back and getting to know these people again and again. When I meet up with these psychedelic collaborators at various festivals or at their homes to work on new projects, to build new efforts to spread these things, both the actual plants and awareness of them, it really strikes me how profound and deep these relationships have become over the years. And I think that it would be interesting to see what it would be like to share more and more of those ceremonial components and personal experiences throughout different groups of psychedelic explorers. Considering that psychedelic experiences are directly and subjectively experienced, the rise of psychedelic entrepreneurs and gurus is somewhat of an absurd phenomenon. How can someone else tell you what you experience? How can someone else tell you what's personally meaningful about your experience? You know, we as human beings are meaning-making creatures. We have experiences, we interpret them, we find connections, and we decide what's significant to our lives. We determine what matters to us and how we want to live, how we want to experience, and what we choose to bring into our lives to share with each other. I think that it's up to us to find ways to apply the significance of our psychedelic experiences to the world at large, rather than sitting back and waiting for someone else to do it for us. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for just a few questions. I think 2 questions, if you have.
At one point you had a slide up there that showed when you were talking about, yeah, this one. One more down, or, yeah, so in Canada, the divide between the Indigenous people, the First Nations Canadians, and the not Indigenous people, which is to say that the people who are actually descended from the colonists, or the colonials,